Good morning to you. We start with breaking news reaching us of large explosions heard in Ukraine's capital city, Kyiv, in the last half an hour. President Putin preparing to meet his Security Council in the coming hours following a blast on the bridge to Crimea, which he's called an act of terrorism by Ukraine. Well, our defence and security editor, Deborah Haynes, is with us. Deborah, good morning. What's going on?
So it's in the last hour, these reports have been breaking about several explosions in the centre of Kyiv. You'll remember the capital came under heavy bombardment at the start of the war, but there's been relative calm there in recent months. So this is very unusual to have strikes right in the heart of the city where government offices are. We don't yet have confirmation yet of what has been hit and whether there have been casualties. But, for example, an advisor to the president has tweeted just now calling Russia a terrorist state again and with a photograph of flames behind a building. The EU ambassador to Ukraine has also tweeted a picture of central Kyiv with smoke rising in the background. Clearly, a very serious number of strikes have hit the capital this morning, and it's at a time when Ukraine was bracing itself for a response from Russia following that strike those attacks, the explosions that you mentioned on the Kerch Strait bridge, that bridge that connects the Crimean Peninsula with the Russian mainland. It was hit by explosions over the weekend. The Russian president is going to be holding a National Security Council meeting today, and this is what he said about that attack last night.
There's no doubt it was a terrorist act directed at the destruction of critically important civilian infrastructure of the Russian Federation. And the authors, perpetrators, and those who ordered it are the special services of Ukraine.
Still with us, Deborah, just hearing several dead and injured in Kyiv.
Well, unfortunately, that's not a surprise with strikes of this magnitude. It's clearly a long-range, large missile strike that's hit the capital. It would have had to have penetrated the capital's very significant and well-tested now air defence systems. And going into the centre of the city, there are residential blocks there as well as government offices. And unfortunately, I imagine as the hours pass, we'll get more details of exactly how many have been injured and potentially killed.
OK, thanks very much indeed. Thank you. Joining us now, Work and Pensions Minister Victoria Prentice. Just want to talk about what's happening in Kyiv to start with. You've been, haven't you? And
yes,
you also support Kyiv refugees who are here.
Yes, I was there almost exactly a year ago. It was the most beautiful city. Well, I'm sure it still is. And it's just awful to hear the news this morning. We've got a young woman who lives with us, who's been with us since March, and she lives in Kyiv normally and has the air raid siren on her telephone, which goes off in our house in my constituency in Banbury. And it's really chilling to hear the news today, actually.
And a thought for those that are in Kyiv at the moment.
Yes, and Zaporizhia overnight was attacked again. It is still, we are still in the absolute midst of war. And we've heard some dreadful stories over the weekend. Her grandparents are living in their cellar in Kherson. They come up in the daytime, but they sleep in the cellar. And they don't actually know whether they voted or not in the recent referendum. A Russian soldier with a gun came to the door and they filled in papers. But what they meant, they don't know. And it's quite salutary, I think, for us to remember what is actually happening at the moment.
How appropriate was it, do you think, for the destruction of the bridge that connects Crimea and Russia? Because he was always going to react to that.
Well, I don't think the Ukrainians have taken responsibility for that destruction, so we have to be very careful, I think. We don't know who was responsible for it. In the Ukrainian mind, that bridge was quite an aggressive act in itself because it linked Crimea to Russia. So the Ukrainians, or certainly the ones who we know, don't like that bridge, but I don't think we know who was responsible for blowing it up.
And he is speaking to his security team this morning, President Putin. He has threatened on more than one occasion the prospect of a nuclear attack. What would you say to him?
Well, I think this is a really worrying time for globally, really. I'm sure that we in this country have done the right thing by the Ukrainians, both by taking them in, but also, very importantly, by supporting them militarily. It's absolutely right that we should continue to stand with the Ukrainians against this Russian aggression. And I really hope that we can de-escalate.
One of the byproducts of the war in Ukraine, of course, is the energy supply, both to Europe and indeed to the UK as well. It's causing all sorts of problems for people here in the United Kingdom going forward, especially going into the winter. Why isn't the government offering an advice campaign, an ad campaign to tell us what to do to try to save energy?
Well, it's something that we're thinking about, but at the moment we don't think we need to spend a lot of public money on a campaign like that. The reason for that is really that we are very lucky, particularly when you look at other places in Europe which don't have the security of energy supply that we have. We're only about 20% reliant on the imports of gas in this country. So we're fairly secure. The National Grid, who advise on this, have said that we have a buffer, and we're pretty certain that we will have enough energy to go through the winter. I mean, certainly the environmentalist in me says, for goodness sake, turn the lights off when you leave a room and use energy very carefully. Of course I do, and that's the way I've brought my children up to behave, and that's the way that I would hope people could be. But I don't think we need to frighten people. And what I'm really worried about is that older people and vulnerable people do need to put the heating on and need to feel able to do that. So we have to get the balance right with the messaging.
Yeah, pretty certain isn't definite, though, is it? I mean,
well, I think in this world, very little is definite. But the National Grid has said that we're fairly secure, we have a buffer, and it's very unlikely, to use their words, that we won't have enough electricity this winter. But, of course, if you're out and about and you're not at home, then, of course, turn the heating down or off.
Some people can't afford to put it on in the first place. But if we're not concerned about it unnecessarily, then why are you advising people not to use as much electricity?
Well, that's only from an environmental point of view rather than a security one. The government is pretty confident that we have enough energy to get us through this winter. We're feeling quite fortunate compared with some of our European friends in that regard. And if we need to give more messaging later on in the winter, then we'll do that. But at the moment, what is important is that we help people to understand that there is enough energy. They should use it if they need it. And if they're old or vulnerable and sitting at home, then they should put the heating on. Of course they should.
Nadeem Zahawi, who describes himself as the Chief Operating Officer for the government, was on the TV yesterday saying we should go to the government website to look for advice. I went and I filled it. Actually, it's not straightforward. I filled in quite a lot of questions. And the outcome was that I needed to buy a £35,000 heat pump.
Was it?
Yes.
Was this an attempt to get you to be more environmental in where your energy came from?
I have no idea, but that's what it was suggesting that I should do in order to try to save energy. But there you go. £12,000 to £37,000, depending on the ground source, and I went further into it, and it said about 35 grand for my heat pump.
Well, I mean, clearly that's not an option that's available to everybody.
No,
I mean,
not.
It may be. I don't know how you answered the questions or what sort of house you live in, but we do need to look at new ways and new renewables to heat our properties. I don't have a heat pump. I'm still on oil, I'm afraid. So I think at home we will be a bit more sparing. We will be a bit more mindful. But I've tried for years to get the children to be more mindful about the energy they use, if I'm honest.
A lot of people are on benefits and would not be able to afford that sort of money, or indeed to put their heating on at all over the winter period. And yet the Prime Minister is looking at, we're being told, not increasing benefits by the rate of inflation. I'm guessing you would implore her to think again on that.
Well, No decision has been taken about the uprating of benefits. This is it's quite a long and process-driven decision-making. And if I could just explain it to you. So tomorrow we'll get the September figures. I know it's October, but they come out tomorrow on earnings. Next week, we'll get the figures on inflation. And then the Secretary of State, my Secretary of State at the Department of Work and Pensions, has a statutory duty to consider those figures. She can't do anything until those figures have come. And she will then consider how to, if at all, uprate benefits and what figure to choose. She has a very wide discretion to do that. We make a decision and we communicate it usually by the end of November. And then I will take through a piece of legislation in the House of Commons, which happens every year in January. And then benefits will be uprated or not, or in accordance with whatever method is chosen in April.
But if we know, which we do according to research that's been done, if we don't increase it by inflation benefits, 450,000 more people will go into absolute poverty.
I think
it's a no-brainer.
I think it's really important we have all the statistics and all the figures about poverty as well at our disposal before we make this critically important decision. It's obviously a really worrying time for people on benefits because they know that inflation is rising and they want us to make this decision as soon as we possibly can so that they have the security of knowing how their benefits will be next year. I get that completely, but I can't possibly make the decision and on my own now. We need to get the figures, get everything at our disposal, and then I will make sure that we make that decision as quickly as possible this year.
OK, but it's going to cost £5 billion if you go with inflation. How will you pay for that? I
think the difference between the two figures, wages or inflation, is about half of that, in fact. But obviously it depends on what those figures are, but we'll know a lot more next week. I think it is really important that we make sure that we target the government resources at the most vulnerable this winter.
OK, talk to me about the SNP, if you would. It's their conference at the moment in Aberdeen. Nicola Sturgeon says she detests everything the Tories stand for. How do you feel about her?
Well, I don't think that's great language to use. And actually, frankly, when you look at the global situation we're in and the war that we were just talking about, I really think it's quite important that we're able politely to disagree with each other in this country. We are so fortunate. We can have a democratic system, so much that we take for granted, and we ought to be able to have sensible discussion about policy without detesting each other. There's no need.
OK, politics of the playground?
Well, it's just not how we do things, I don't think.
Talk to me about some suggestions in the newspapers this morning that I'm reading that Tom Watson should be given a peerage. That was knocked back a couple of years ago, but Sir Keir Starmer is looking again at Tom Watson getting a peerage. What do you think?
Well, it's a matter for the Labour Party who they put forward for peerages.
But is it distasteful, given what
I've never really... I'm not the world expert on that story. I know that there was...
Well, let me tell you. He had been accused, or he is now being accused of insulting the victims of false sex abuse allegations. Lady Britain, as in Lord Britain's
wife.
Yeah, his widow branded Mr Watson despicable and offensive. As you know, he was falsely accused of rape and child abuse as a result of this campaign that had been conducted at the time. Harvey Procter falsely accused of being a child murderer by this fantasist as well, supported by Tom Watson. Should he get a peerage?
Well, my difficulty is, Kay, is that I don't know what Tom Watson believed. I don't know. I really can't advocate for him in any way. He was clearly taken in by somebody who was making up very unpleasant and malicious stories about prominent men at the time. What Tom Watson believed at any one time, I really can't
tell you. It wasn't something that you would say...
Well, I think it's very important that anybody who gets a peerage should be very carefully investigated. And I do think, to go to your earlier point, that it is quite important that we're very careful in public life about who we accuse of what.
So everybody should be thoroughly investigated before they get a peerage. What about Conor Burns?
I don't think there's any suggestion that Conor Burns is getting a peerage
Yeah, there
at
is.
the moment.
Yeah, there is. Yeah, apparently his name is on the list that the former Prime Minister has put forward.
Well, I hadn't heard that.
What do you
Kay.
think? Should he get one?
I think where we are, what's happened, I don't know any more about that. Well, I probably know less about the facts of the incident than you do. I think what's important is that the Chief Whip has been asked to investigate this. I think that she must do that as quickly and as thoroughly as possible. It's a really difficult situation for all involved, not least the accuser, the victim, the alleged victim, if you like. And I think it's really important that we solve this particular problem as quickly as we can.
Before he gets a knighthood.
What is impressive is that the Prime Minister took very swift action.
She did.
To make sure that Conor was removed from office while the matter is investigated. But I think from his point of view, as well as anybody else involved, we just need to get on with working out what happened.
The young Ukrainian girl that lives with you, what's her name?
Vika.
OK, well, we hope
Another
she's
Victoria.
Okay. Yeah, we hope she's OK, and we hope that the family are as well.
She's, it's a great privilege having her to stay,
sure.
actually.
Sure.
But we do feel the war is very close.
We must let you go. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Ms Preston. Thank you. A quick look at the papers for you now here on Sky. Starting with the Eye, reporting Liz Truss will encourage her party to put on a unified front as polls continue to show Labour far in the lead. The Express asked Tory rebels to stop plotting and show loyalty with the picture of the Business Secretary Jacob Rees-Mogg. The Times says the Prime Minister has begun a charm offensive to try to shore up her party. But The Guardian reporting her MPs are keeping up the pressure to force her to raise benefits in line with inflation. The Metro describes Russian attacks on Ukraine after the strike on the bridge linking Crimea and Russia as the wrath of Putin. Telegraph reports Putin describing the attacks as an act of terrorism by Ukraine. FT reporting on the US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen saying OPEC's move to cut production is unwise. The Mail leads with claims universities are changing the way they teach several subjects. And the Mirror reports the man convicted of the acid attack on the TV presenter Katie Piper is on the run. And The Sun says the next series of The Crown is likely to prove controversial, unlike the others, as it shows Prince Philip pursuing an affair. We were talking about that winter blackout we're warning with the minister there, but will it mean refiring up our coal-fired power stations in order to cope with the energy crisis? Shaman is with us now. She's at Greenwich Power Station, which used to be powered by coal and is now gas. Hello, good morning to you. What's the latest where you are?
Good morning, Kay. Well, as you can see, the power station behind me, and as you rightly said, used to be powered by coal, but it's now used as a sort of backup power plant for TfL in case there is an entire or partial loss of energy provided by the national grid. But this is kind of a poster child of the type of direction we wanted to go in, using more low carbon energy supply. However, we are now being warned. This is a new report from the national grid. It's highlighted that some contingency plans may have to be put in place in order to meet some of the demands this winter. So it could mean more of the coal power stations being opened back up again. Now, we only actually have a couple of them left in the country, one of them being in Nottinghamshire and another one being in North Yorkshire. So it could mean opening them back up. And this is quite worrying, especially for climate change protesters and climate change activists. This coal is not the type of direction we want to go in. It burns way more carbon dioxide than oil or gas, which is why we had been phasing them out in the first place. Now, it is important to remember that both the National Grid and the government have said that blackouts are unlikely, but the National Grid are worried enough to have contingency plans put in place, including ones like these.
OK, thank you. Thanks a lot. Just want to show you these pictures that are just reaching us here at Sky Centre. Situation developing in Ukraine. Limited information at this stage, but we can see thick black smoke there rising in the distance in Kyiv. Well, when it's black smoke like that, it means that the fire is still raging. We are being told that there are injuries and deaths. We've no idea at this stage what has happened. The city's mayor, Vitaly Klitschko, saying there have been several explosions in that district of Kyiv, which is in the centre of the capital. This is after, I should say, President Putin referring to an act of terrorism, in his words, a bridge that links Crimea with mainland Russia. That has been severely damaged in places after some explosions over the weekend. Call that an act of terrorism. He is speaking with his security team and personnel later on this morning. We'll get more information on that and, of course, update you. But these are the latest pictures that we are receiving from Kyiv, where pools of black smoke are rising into the morning sky there. Also still to come on the programme, as Taiwan's president says the country will bolster its defences amid tensions with China. I'm going to be speaking to the island's Deputy Foreign Minister. Labour's Shadow Minister for Mental Health, that's Dr Rosanna Allen-Khan, will be with me shortly after 8. And as the government opens up further oil and gas exploration to help with the energy crisis, asking the former permanent special representative on climate change, Sir David King, how it marries with our environmental goals. Convicted swindler Anna Sorokin has spoken to the New York Times about her hopes to remain in the city despite the risks of deportation. For years, she used the name Anna Delvey to pass herself off as the wealthy daughter of a German diplomat, and her case became the basis for the popular Netflix series Inventing Anna. She was released on Friday to house arrest after serving 3 years in jail for conning $250,000 from banks, hotels, and rich New Yorkers. This is what she told the New York Times. They denied bail before. It was an exercise in perseverance. So many immigration lawyers told me I'd get deported to Mars before I get out in New York. She went on to say, letting them deport me would have been like a sign of capitulation, confirmation of this perception of me as this shallow person who only cares about obscene wealth, and that's just not the reality. In other news, police are searching for the man who threw acid over the television presenter Katie Piper after he was recalled to jail for breaching his licence conditions. Ms Piper was left fighting for her life back in 2008 when Stefan Sylvester threw acid over her face in a targeted attack arranged by her ex-boyfriend. She suffered significant injuries that left her permanently scarred and blind in one eye. Stefan Sylvester was given a life term in 2009 for the attack. He was released in 2018 after serving a minimum term of 6 years in prison. Sylvester fled after being recalled to jail for breaching those conditions. While a probation service spokeswoman said, we are urgently working with the police to bring the offender back to prison where he'll face longer behind bars. OK, we just some more breaking news for you. Just been telling you what's been happening in Kyiv and explosions there where we're told injuries and death. Now hearing about explosions in Lviv, that is to the west of Dnipro. That, according to the Reuters news agency. So that's within the last few moments. We're also hearing about explosions in Lviv, as well as those explosions and fires in Kyiv. We'll get more on that and update you further. Looking at some of today's other headlines for you now, and a 22-year-old woman who was killed in a hit-and-run in Shropshire has been named as Rebecca Steer. The steer and another pedestrian were struck by a vehicle after it mounted a curb outside a restaurant in Oswestry early on Sunday morning. She later died in hospital. A 28-year-old man has been arrested on suspicion of murder. Hundreds have gathered at vigils across Ireland in memory of the 10 people who died in an explosion at a petrol station in County Donegal. A 5-year-old girl who was buying a birthday cake for her mum was among the victims. Her father was also killed. Another victim, Jessica Gallagher, is being remembered as an up-and-coming designer with her whole life ahead of her.
She just turned 24 last week, or 2 weeks ago, and she was going on to do fashion in Belfast. She had just got a new job in Belfast, and she was going up yesterday, but unfortunately with the gas explosion she wasn't able to make it.
New research suggests thousands of children in England and Wales are receiving poorer quality school meals due to food shortages and rising prices. A survey which represents school meal providers found organisations are using more processed food and are considering switching to imported meat to cope with rising costs.
We recognise that this is the one hot meal that many children get, whether they're receiving a universal infant free school meal, or indeed buying a meal. This is their opportunity to do that in a school setting where they're safe, where they're ready to learn. So the meals that are being provided are healthy and nutritious, but they're not where they could be if funding was addressed to deal with the issue.
Now, here's something you may be able to relate to. New research showing that more than 2/3 of us experience the so-called Sunday scaries. It's the feeling of anxiety about the week ahead as many of us face stress in the workplace. It comes as the World Health Organization issues new guidelines for employers to provide help. Here's Shingy.
Lauren's life is full of colour. She runs an eco-friendly glitter business and loves her work. But things haven't always sparkled. Her old job as an air hostess left her tired, depressed and drained. This is how she felt at her lowest before leaving last year.
It got to the point where I would do a really long day flying, and every day for about 2 weeks I got home and I just sat on my bed, that exhausted, I couldn't even get out of my uniform, and just sat there crying. I was making myself ill from stress from work.
She says her employers failed to support her through difficult moments, like the death of her best friend and her mum's cancer diagnosis, making long, grueling days even harder.
You know, when you've lost somebody, you want to go and support your family and be there for them, but you can't do that. You need to put on a smile and a brave face and deal with hundreds of people in a day in a metal tube in the sky where you've got no escape.
New figures show those feelings of dreading a job are common. The research reveals 67% of British employees experience anxiety about the week ahead. The top triggers are work stress at 72%, lack of rest and sleep also at 72%, and their to-do list for the week ahead at 70%. They also found that 53% of people feel anxious about working in person, compared to 6% of people who feel anxious about working from home. Statistics like those are why the WHO has laid out new guidance. It includes training managers to support staff and advice on helping people come back from mental health-related absences.
If you support effectively the mental health of your workforce, you are not losing out on productivity losses, not losing out on where people reach a point where they have to take absence because they're not doing as well. That's really important. And also, you're retaining your staff.
It's about the finer details. Focusing on how every person feels at work will make the difference. Shingi Marike, Sky News.
Well, if you have been affected by the issues raised in that piece or are in need of mental health support, contact the charity Mind for help. You can reach them on mind.org.uk. And don't forget, of course, you can always reach out to the Samaritans. They are always there for you. We'll get the number on the screen coming up for you in just a second. Quick look at the weather.
Anticipation is rising, and so is the atmosphere. Are you ready? The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Mostly fine couple of days after the southeast dries up this morning. Rain in the Atlantic for late on Tuesday.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Some of the photos that have caught our eye this morning for you. Josh has put them together. A full hunter's moon rises over Dover Castle in Kent. As the first full moon of October, the moon appears much bigger and more orange than normal. Now, I want to say hunter's moon, is that when there's two in a month? Can't remember. I know somebody will tell me. Tweet me if you'd like to, at Kay Burley. This picture is taken from the opening night of the Hull Fair, one of the largest travelling fairs in Europe, which features over 250 rides, 4 Ferris wheels amongst them, and a stunning view of the sailing boats participating in the 54th edition of the traditional Barco Iana Regatta in the Gulf of Trieste in northeast Italy. There was also a dog that I'd seen in one of the papers. I don't know where he is, but he'll be here for the next hour. Now, as Taiwan's president says the country will bolster its defences amid tensions with China, going to be speaking to the island's Deputy Foreign Minister coming up very shortly. Latest situation in Ukraine. There have been several explosions heard in Kyiv and also Lviv. We are being told by the mayor of Kyiv that Vitaly Klitschko, that there have been some deaths. Talking tomorrow's here, as you can see, we're talking to the minister, and she's actually looking after some Ukrainian families at the moment. She was very alarmed by what was happening.
That's right. A lot of MPs are actually hosting Ukrainian families. I spoke to some at the Conservative conference, and of course they know that it may be a long haul because many of the Ukrainian families here will not be able to go back anytime soon because of the terrible events there, and just one of the many challenges for Liz Truss, how on earth the West sees this conflict going on. Of course, she's made a huge promise in her leadership campaign to put 3% of our GDP, of our national income, into defence, because she said the West was asleep at the wheel about Russia and the threat it posed. And I think as she makes difficult decisions along the line, not least about benefits, many of her MPs will want to hold her to that one.
We're asking actually about benefits to the minister. This is what she said.
No decision has been taken about the uprating of benefits. This is it's quite a long and process-driven decision-making. I think it's really important that we have all the statistics and all the figures about poverty as well at our disposal before we make this critically important decision. It's obviously a really worrying time for people on benefits because they know that inflation is rising and they want us to make this decision as soon as we possibly can so that they have the security of knowing how their benefits will be next year. I get that completely, but I can't possibly make the decision on my own now. We need to get the figures, get everything at our disposal, and then I will make sure that we make that decision as quickly as possible.
Well, the minister there described the decision on how much to raise benefits by next year as critically important. Critically important not just for the millions of people who rely on universal credit, many of whom are working, but also for the Prime Minister herself. After she made that U-turn on cutting the top rate of tax for the wealthiest people, it gave many in her cabinet and on her backbenchers the feeling that they could now get her to cave in on more. Now, Liz Truss has never actually said publicly, I don't want to raise benefits by inflation, but we know that that is something that's been discussed in government as a way to save money to pay for some of these tax cuts. She's now under great pressure, I understand, including from senior figures in her cabinet, to raise benefits by inflation next year.
Okay.
The minister revealed it's the end of November when we'll find out.
Thanks very much, Tamara. Well, the president of Taiwan has been speaking this morning to mark the island's National Day, saying that a war with China is absolutely not an option. Joining us now is Taiwan's Deputy Foreign Affairs Minister, Dr. Tsai Ming-yen. Hello to you, Doctor. Thank you for joining us. What do you think is going to happen next in this incredibly tense situation?
Yes, I think we all understand that the Chinese behavior are becoming more and more aggressive and provocative. So China not only send its military aircraft to intrude into Taiwan's air defense zone, but also carry out very big scale of military exercise around Taiwan in this August. So we believe China's final objective is to alter the status quo of this region and to show that China is becoming a predominant power in this part of the world under the strong leadership of Chinese leaders, Xi Jinping. So what China is currently doing is to, carry out all kinds of rehearsals for military action against Taiwan, and then to test the bottom line of our global community. So what I'm telling you is that China is using Taiwan Strait as a playground, and Taiwan has become a frontline state against China's expansion. So how to tackle the uncertainties and problems caused by a powerful and aggressive China has become so challenging, not only to Taiwan, but also to so many countries around the globe and the region.
OK, we have been hearing that Chinese fighters, the fighter jets that intrude Taiwan's airspace will be regarded as a first strike. Does Taiwan currently have the military capability to prevent a first strike or indeed an invasion?
Yes, first of all, we stay on very high alert on all kinds of military activity or movement taken by China. And secondly, we have been making every effort to beef up our defense capacity. For example, in next year, Taiwan's defense budget will be increased by about 14%. And that would account for about 2.3% of our GDP. So we have been making every effort to improve Taiwan's long-term military strength so as to increase the potential cost for invasion from the other side of the Taiwan Strait. And the priority of our defense modernization go to our submarine force, air defense system, missile force, and the promotion of the integration between our civilian society and the defense sector. So the message that we would like to send is very clear. That is, Taiwan is not intimidated, and Taiwan's future and democracy can never be decided or dominated by China's military activity or military program.
Tomorrow, I think it's tomorrow, the national holiday of Taiwan, and military parades planned, all sorts of celebrations in that regard. How are you going to ensure that China doesn't see this as provocation?
Yes, I think Taiwan has been, stick to the principle to, maintaining the status quo in the Taiwan Strait. And that is a common ground, that is a consensus reached by our society. And that is the reason why, because Taiwan's policy toward China has been so predictable. So we have been receiving increasing support from our international friends. So if you look at United States has been taking a very important role to group like-minded friends like US, India, Japan and Australia, a new mechanism called as Quad to promote the diplomatic cooperation to check and balance the Chinese behavior, and that based on their trust to Taiwan's policy that is very predictable and very stable.
OK, good to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on the programme. Thank you.
A pleasure. Thank you.
Returning now to the war in Ukraine, and the US President Joe Biden has warned that the conflict has raised the risk of nuclear Armageddon to its highest level since the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. Joined now by Dr. Robert Bell, who's previously worked as defence advisor at NATO and also the US National Security Council during Bill Clinton's time at the White House. It's good to see you. Thank you for joining us on the programme this morning. Let's just talk about that language that we heard from Joe Biden. Was that appropriate language at the moment?
I think it's entirely appropriate that the president remind us that these stakes are very high, that President Putin's language is totally reckless. At the same time, it's also important that he remind us that we have dealt with nuclear intimidation before, and that societies have to be prepared to steel their resolve, if you will, in the face of such threats. We cannot just simply be intimidated.
But is it not escalating the war by, or the threat of war and nuclear attacks by using words like Armageddon?
Armageddon is a term that I think almost everyone associates with nuclear weapons. There's not much dispute on this. President Putin himself joined President Xi and President Biden, Boris Johnson and Emmanuel Macron. At the beginning of this year, the leaders of the permanent members of the Security Council put out a joint statement saying that a nuclear war could never be won and must never be fought. That harkens, I think, to the scale of catastrophic damage that would follow from a nuclear war that escalated to a general exchange.
Talk to me about what's happening, if you would please, in Ukraine this morning. We're hearing that there have been explosions in Kyiv and also in Lviv. This follows the attack on the bridge between Crimea and Russia over the weekend. We're hearing from the mayor of Kyiv, and he's saying the capital is under attack from Russian terrorists. The rockets hit objects in the city centre. The air alert and therefore the threat continues. I appeal to all residents of the capital to stay in shelters during the alarm if there is no urgent need. It is better not to go to the city today. We were starting to get the impression that things were getting back to normal in Kyiv. That is clearly not the case this morning.
Well, the Russians have a limited supply of long-range missiles that they can shoot in from sanctuaries, either to the east in the Donbass or from over Russia itself or the Black Sea. Clearly, President Putin has been terribly embarrassed by the attack on the Kerch Bridge. He also has a new commander for the overall war, Air Force General Surovikin. And between the two, the new commander wanting to show that he's going to be tough, President Putin needing to show the Russian people that the Kerch Bridge bombing is going to be revenged. Someone made a tactical decision overnight to launch a wave of precision strikes into major cities. And that's extremely tragic for the Ukrainian people. It's also part of the Russian playbook as this war has progressed. We're becoming almost immune now to the reality that Russia's only card they can play is to strike these civilian targets in urban areas.
So you see this as a direct retaliation for what happened, the attacks in Kyiv this morning, direct retaliation for the images that we're seeing now of the Kerch Bridge connecting Crimea to Russia?
Yes, and to the disadvantage of the Russians, assuming Ukraine's morale holds, which I assume it will, because their supply of these weapons is dwindling, and they really, you would think logically, would save those for important military targets. This terror bombing of cities may make the Russians feel better, but it's not helping them defeat their Ukrainian counteroffensives at all.
We know that President Putin is meeting with his security personnel later on today. I'm sure we'll hear more about that in the fullness of time. He has told us several times now that he's not bluffing. What is your view on someone who has to tell you that they're not bluffing?
Well, he has said from the beginning that he is totally serious about this. Going back to February 24th, he said, there will be severe consequences if anyone interferes with my operation in Ukraine. We clearly in the West have interfered with this operation with weaponry, with intelligence, with sanctions. So we have, in effect, called his bluff for 7 months. He's now trying to be more explicit. I think it's conceivable if he felt he had no other options left that he might be insane enough to use a tactical nuclear weapon. But I don't think he thinks he's lost yet. He has a new commander. He's done a partial mobilization. Winter is coming. He has doubts about European resolve given the energy situation. So I think the chances remain low sitting here in October. It could be a different situation come spring or summer.
We are just hearing very emotive words from President Zelensky. He says, if I could just read it out for the benefit of you, of course, and also our viewers, it's via the official Telegram account. The 229th day of full-scale war. On the 229th day, they are trying to destroy us and wipe us off the face of the earth. In general, destroy our people who are sleeping at home in Zaporizhia, kill people who go to work in Dnipro and Kyiv. The air alarm does not subside throughout Ukraine. There are missiles hitting. Unfortunately, there are dead and wounded. Please do not leave shelters. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. Let's hold on and be strong. That from President Zelensky. What more, if anything, can NATO do to try to help the people of Ukraine?
Well, I think NATO has pushed the sanctions button about as deeply as you can push it, perhaps a little bit more on the energy side. Trying to get India and China to help us with the sanctions would make sense, particularly in the face of this Russian terror bombing. On the military side, we're up to very highly capable weapons now that we're providing. The only thing that's not been provided is modern fighter aircraft or deep strike ballistic missiles. I don't see the West going to boots on the ground or no-fly zone yet, but if there were a nuclear use, I think either of those options would certainly be considered.
Good to talk to you. Thank you for taking the time to join us. Thank you.
Right.
The leader of the Lib Dems, and that's Ed Davey, of course, is with us now. I'm sure you're monitoring events in Ukraine this morning. Good morning to you. Sir Ed, what are your thoughts?
I think all our thoughts and prayers are with the people of Ukraine. I think the words of President Zelensky there really sum up the issue. The Ukrainians have been brave and courageous throughout this. The UK, with our NATO allies, have been supporting them fully. And I actually strongly agree with our government in the work that we have done to support the Ukrainians. But we need to be there the whole time. We need to be with them until they succeed and drive Russia out of their country.
We know that there was an attack on the bridge between Crimea and Russia at the weekend. Was that totally appropriate?
Listen, I will allow the Ukrainians to decide what they think is the right way of fighting this war. I'm not going to be an armchair general in London. What I do know is Ukrainians had their country illegally invaded by a nasty dictator, and we need to be behind them. This is, yes, it's a fight for the freedom of Ukraine, but it's a fight for democracy around the world. If we were to allow Putin to get away with this appalling invasion of another country, it would send all the wrong signals across the world, whether it's to China or elsewhere. It's absolutely essential to the fight for freedom and democracy that we stand shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine the whole way through this.
Talk to me about matters at home. We know that the government is thinking about what to do as far as benefits are concerned, whether they should increase in line with inflation or whether it should be real-time wages. We're now being told, we were originally told that it looked as though Liz Truss wanted to go with the lesser of the two options. We're now being told that no decision has been made. Is that pressure from backbenchers, do you think?
Well, I hope so, but I think the government needs to think about the millions of people out there who would be struggling even more if they failed to take this policy. You know, I go around my constituency and talk to people who are in work but require support from universal credit. I talk to people who are on disability benefits, real people who are struggling already, struggling, frankly, more than they've had to do for many years. If the government was so hard-hearted not to uprate benefits by inflation, I think that would be a social catastrophe. And look what they're doing at the same time. They've talked about tax cuts for the richest people. Now, they may have U-turned on that. They're still giving huge tax cuts for large corporations, much of which is going to the big banks. They're refusing to bring in a windfall tax, a proper windfall tax on the unexpected high profits of the oil and gas companies. This is a government that's completely out of touch with what's happening in our country. They've got their priorities wrong. What Liberal Democrats are saying is we need to support people out there who are struggling families. We should do that as our top priority. We shouldn't be thinking about tax cuts for the wealthiest and for the biggest businesses.
Nicola Sturgeon says that she detests Tories and everything they stand for. Do you?
I wouldn't use that language. My view is that Liberal Democrats want to get rid of the Conservatives. As Liberal Democrat leader, my top priority is to defeat as many Conservative MPs at the next election as possible. The Conservatives are taking people for granted in their constituencies. They either don't get what's happening to people or don't care. And this out-of-touch government has to go. And so Liberal Democrats are striving every sinew to oppose this appalling government and put forward our constructive, alternative, positive policies. You know, we were the first party to argue for a windfall tax so we could raise the money in a responsible way to help people struggling with fuel bills. And we will continue to oppose the Tories and put forward strong alternative policies. OK, we're almost out of time, but I do want your opinion on this. Should either Tom Watson or Conor Burns get knighthoods? Neither.
Thank you very much for joining us on the programme.
Thank you.
Let me update you on what's happening in Ukraine, should I? The 229th day of full-scale war is how President Zelensky has described it on his official Telegram page. He goes on, let me read it to you. On the 229th day, they are trying to destroy us and wipe us off the face of the earth. In general, destroy our people who are sleeping at home in Zaporizhia, kill people who go to war in Dnipro and Kyiv. The air alarm does not subside throughout Ukraine. There are missiles hitting. Unfortunately, there are dead and wounded. Please do not leave shelters. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. Let's hold on and be strong. And this is in relation to incidents over the weekend in Zaporizhia where people died. And these are attacks that we've seen in the capital of Kyiv this morning. We're not sure of the number, although we have heard from Mayor Klitschko. He says there are injured and dead as part of these attacks on Kyiv this morning. There have also been attacks in Lviv as well, being told that there are certainly casualties in Lviv too. All of this has come after the Kerch Bridge, which connects Crimea, just opened a few years ago now, connects Crimea to central Russia. This happened to it over the weekend. Just watch these pictures. There you go. Parts of it have been severely damaged. No one has yet claimed responsibility, but the Russians are very confident that Ukraine has carried out these attacks, severely damaging this bridge. It would certainly be fair enough to say that the people of Ukraine are not content with this bridge. These are the latest pictures that we're just receiving now from Kyiv, where we are being told, my goodness me, where we are being told that there are deaths and injuries as a result of several attacks this morning. We are also hearing that President Putin will be speaking to his security personnel later on today. We'll hear the very latest on that when we can. But more deaths in the capital of Ukraine, Kyiv,